1956 is one of those really rare moments in time when it seems as if history is somehow accelerating. So you have, like in the space of a few weeks, the world watching as old imperial assumptions implode, a post-colonial sovereignty starts to assert itself, and most importantly of all, I think, the limits of Cold War power are completely laid bare. And this happens in such a shockingly short amount of time. And right at the heart of this, you have the Suez Crisis, which is remembered very differently depending on where you live in the world. So in Britain, it's the story of humiliation. It's the story of imperial decline. In Egypt and across the Arab world, it is remembered as a moment of liberation. In Israel, it is deemed, depending on who you talk to, a military success, a strategic gamble, but everybody agrees a decision with lasting consequence. So today we're going to discuss what happened, how it happened, and what it means to us today. And I think probably it would be good to start with a cast list and describe sort of the main protagonists in this. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do a separate person. So Alex, can we start with you? Anthony Eden.
So Anthony Eden was the Prime Minister of Britain at this point. And he had a sort of interesting background relating to this, in that he'd been Foreign Secretary or in some sort of Foreign Secretary type role for many, many years and was actually regarded as being rather good at it. But he'd been waiting a long time to become Prime Minister, while Winston Churchill hung on and on and on. And they actually started getting on really quite badly, and Churchill was quite bullying towards him and sort of wouldn't leave the role. And Eden's nerves got thinner and thinner. And he was regarded actually particularly as a great specialist in the Middle East. He spoke Arabic and Persian, he'd done Oriental languages at Oxford, and he certainly saw himself as a great expert in that region. One of his closest friends was Nouri al-Said, who was the Prime Minister of Iraq. And a big project of his was the Baghdad Pact, which was trying to unite kind of across not just the Middle East, but also, from Turkey to Pakistan, in an alliance that would give Britain some continuing influence in that region.
And also, one of the things you said, can I also ask that you start the clock? So otherwise we could talk here, we'll be here for 3 weeks. So unless you put a timer on us, we're never going to leave. Just one thing occurred to me is you said, his nerves were fraying because Churchill was really bullying him. A thin skin is going to be important in this
It's
story.
very important. Yeah. And, he was one of those people who'd been sort of Prime Minister waiting for a very long time. And I think by this point, when he'd come in as Prime Minister, quite shortly before this kicked off, things had been going quite badly ever since. The economy was in a bad state in Britain. It was in a state of decline, obviously. India had had independence in 1947, so the empire was already kind of, in effect, gone, and now being called the Commonwealth. But Eden was still a product of that world.
Very much so.
A great deal of anxiety about that.
And all of this, you have to get under the bonnet of the personalities to understand why things unravel the way they do. Oh, we've now lost 10 minutes. It's all so exciting. I said time went quickly during Suez. It's now gone faster than you could possibly imagine on this stage. Can you tell us about David Ben-Gurion?
David Ben-Gurion was the Prime Minister and Defense Minister in 1956. And he was a hardline leader. There was a school of moderation in Israel represented by Moshe Sharet, but Ben-Gurion fired him in early 1956 in order to clear the decks for an attack on Egypt. Ben-Gurion believed that a Jewish state could be created and maintained in the Middle East, in the heartland of the Arab world, only unilaterally and by military force, and that Arab opposition was absolute and inescapable. So he was a believer in military force, and he was also an expansionist. And one of his aims in launching the Suez War was expansion, but I'll come back to that later. What Ben-Gurion, in September 1955, there was a Czech arms deal where the Soviet bloc supplied arms to Israel. And I worked in the Ben-Gurion archives in the Negev, and I found a file under the title Preventive War. And all the defense and military chiefs were saying to Ben-Gurion, the Czech arms deal tips the balance and is a threat to us, and therefore we should initiate war. And this was the idea of a preventive war.
Right, and the Czech arms deal, just to be clear, I think you said the arms were sent to Israel. You meant Egypt is what you meant.
Yes,
yeah.
it was Czech arms to Egypt.
To Egypt, right. Yeah.
And in this folder, I found one letter by Doris May. Doris May was, had done classics at Oxford. She was the secretary of the Zionist leader, Chaim Weizmann. During the Blitz, Ben-Gurion spent a lot of time with Doris May in London, and one thing led to another, and they became lovers. So I found a letter by Doris May in the folder, and it said, Dear David, and no one called Ben-Gurion David. Even his wife called him Ben-Gurion. And the letter by Doris Day said, Dear David, there is no such a thing as a preventive war. The so-called preventive war will initiate a war that might have been stopped. And the logic was impeccable. And it was a tribute to the classical education that Doris May received at Oxford. But Ben-Gurion pretended it was a defensive war. And this is a theme in Israeli policy all along. They always claim to be defensive. They claim that all the wars are defensive. They pose as the victims, when in fact they're the aggressors.
Okay, so I mean, we're going to get into a lot of this, but just I want to get Nasser described as well, because such a huge giant of a figure in the Arab world, and indeed in the minds, living rent-free in the minds of the old West, if you like, the old money Britain as well. What was he like? And tell us a little bit about him.
I mean, well, Nasser, of course, is the president of Egypt, was the president of Egypt, the leader of Egypt, and most of all, he is, in a sense, the world. I mean, if Ben-Gurion is Israel and Anthony Eden is the UK, in other words, the imperial powers of the 19th century, in a sense, Nasser represented the world. He represented Egypt, he represented the Arab world, he represented, in a sense, India, he represented Asia, he represented Africa, he represented all the peoples around the world who wanted dignity, self-determination, and freedom from colonialism. And that's what Nasser is in a nutshell, a person who could communicate with his own people in a very basic language that doesn't require very much sort of interpretation. It's basically, I understand what my people want. They want freedom. I understand what the world wants, freedom. And that's, of course, why the colonial powers, Britain and France and Israel, ganged up against him after the nationalization of the Suez Canal.
On nationalization, it's hard to overestimate the absolute shockwaves that his decision to nationalize the Suez Canal created. Was it a decision that the Arab world always expected him to make, or did it take them by surprise?
I mean, I think when he announced it in July 1956, I think it was a shock. It was a surprise. It was elation. But remember, I mean, Nasser is not the first person in the Third World to nationalize assets of the Third World. I mean, Mossadegh in Iran, of course, tried to nationalize Anglo-Iranian oil in Iran and was overthrown by Britain and the United States. And so here was a leader who stood up to the colonial powers and defied them. And one has to understand what that means to people around the world, especially in the non-Western world, what it means to actually stand up, hold your ground, have dignity, for all the flaws internal to Egypt, have dignity and actually tell the Western colonial powers that we're in a new age, an age where people can determine their own futures.
Yeah, and just coming back to you, and we're going to spend a lot of time, hopefully, unrolling this whole story, but even though Ben-Gurion received this letter from his lover and ignored it completely, what was the argument that was being made and sold in Israel? Because certainly, he was saying, we need to do this for security, we have Fedayeen raids, this is something that has to happen or we will not, this is an extinction level event for us.
There was no real security threat to Israel because it was Israel which was pursuing a policy of military retaliation all the time against its neighbors. And there was a particularly vicious raid against Gaza in February 1955, led by Ariel Sharon, the commander of a commando unit who later became a war criminal and prime minister. So there wasn't a real threat to Israel. Nasser only turned to the Soviet Union for arms, for defensive arms, to defend his military regime against aggression by Israel. But this, and Ben-Gurion's reasons were that the colonial powers had decided after the nationalization of the Suez Canal to attack Egypt.
Yeah. Well,
and he jumped on the bandwagon.
So Avi is very central to us knowing anything about these secret discussions and secret hysterics that were going on behind the scene. Because it did certainly feel to the world, and from what you're saying, Ussama, to the Arab world as well, that this is like this decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was one of the most important arterial routes in the world, was catastrophic. So you have a blocked artery, a heart attack will follow. Now, that heart attack took the form of the Sèvres Protocols. Can you just sum up, Alex, what the Sèvres Protocols were?
Absolutely, but let me just sort of explain briefly with that, because people talk about the nationalization of the Suez Canal. First of all, it's the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, to be a pedant, in that the actual physical Suez Canal, in fact, belonged to Egypt and always had. The company who ran it was run by technically an international consortium in which Britain had managed to acquire the largest share, to the great irritation of the French, and therefore was run by, effectively this private company that was co-owned. And that's what Nasser nationalized. But we can overstate that as the reason for why they went ahead with this protocol and this war, because in fact we know that months before the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company by Nasser, Egypt was already Anthony Eden's great priority, and there was a phone call he made in March 1956 to one of his ministers saying that he wanted Nasser murdered. Those were the words he used, "I want him murdered." And this was because Eden had developed a kind of pathological obsession with Nasser, which actually is very much for the reasons that Ussama said, that he represented this kind of young, virile, kind of, new post-colonial order that Eden really didn't like.
He didn't like that, but there's a bit of spice in this story.
Well, there is, since we've already had Ben-Gurion's affair.
Let's talk about.
We should also mention.
Let's do it.
That in February 1955, Eden actually went to Egypt. He was still foreign secretary at this point with his wife, and his wife was much younger than him. It was his second wife, who was also Winston Churchill's niece. This did not make Churchill like him anymore. This did not improve their relationship. Anyway, Clarissa, so they went to Egypt and had this dinner with Nasser, and it went very badly because Eden sort of went in there rather pompously and sort of started talking in classical Arabic and, sort of reciting great encomiums and so forth, which Nasser found rather baffling, and then told him he had to join the Baghdad Pact and all of this, and Nasser said, "No, I don't think it's really up to you how I organize my military arrangements, thank you very much." And at this dinner, Eden got more and more angry and frustrated. And there's a sort of sense that this great embarrassment that he felt in front of his young wife, as Nasser sort of refused to obey him or accept any of his arguments, was the only time they met. And it seems to have been a real trigger at some psychological level to the idea that he was a great foe and an enemy. Deeply personal.
So you've got all of that sort of psychodrama going on in the background, where I like to think, sort of Eden looking at Clarissa, looking at Nasser plays a role, a major role in.
I mean, Nasser is really very good looking.
He was very good looking.
And I think it's worth
right?
just mentioning.
Okay. But the Sèvres Protocol that we've mentioned, just for those who may not know, is a meeting that takes place between the 22nd to the 24th of October in 1956. There is a private villa in Sèvres, just outside Paris, and these main leaders who are shocked from the West and want to do something about it have this top secret meeting. But the thing is, we know about it largely thanks to Avi having excavated the records. How did you get them to release those records, Avi?
The Suez War the Suez War is the best documented war plot in history because of the Protocol of Sèvres. So there was a secret meeting in Sèvres, north of Paris, between the French, the British, and the Israelis. There was the French Prime Minister Guy Mollet. Eden didn't go. He was represented by Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary, whose heart wasn't in it, and Ben-Gurion led the Israeli delegation. And they negotiated for 2 days and came up with a scenario. And the scenario was that Israel would initiate warlike acts against Egypt. Britain and France would pose as the peacemakers and give ultimata to the two sides to withdraw 5 miles from the canal. Egypt would refuse, Israel would agree, and that would be the excuse for the colonial powers to attack Egypt. And all the details of this, the sequence of events, was detailed in the Protocol of Sèvres, which was 3 pages, typed and initialed by the 3 leaders of the delegations.
Yeah.
There were 3 copies.
Yeah.
The French had the top copy, and they lost it. And the British representative, Sir Patrick Dean, reported to Eden, and Eden was shocked because this was a smoking gun.
Yeah.
He thought it would be all secret.
Yeah.
So he ordered the cabinet's secretary to destroy the British copy, and the second carbon copy went to Ben-Gurion, and Ben-Gurion folded it and put it inside the vest of his suit, and he took it home, and it was in the Ben-Gurion archives, and it was never released. So I wrote to Shimon Peres, who was also at Sèvres, when he was foreign minister, and I said, we all know that there is this protocol. You have the only copy. Will you release it? He said, yes, but the protocol is an international treaty, so I'll need to have the consent of Britain and France to release it. So I wrote to the cabinet secretary, and he replied, said, yes, 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 we agree, and we want to see it. And a few months went by, and he wrote to me, and he said, well, where is it? And the Director General of the Quai d'Orsay also gave me a written permission. I sent the 2 permissions to Paris, and then he released the Protocol of Sèvres, which was in the safe of the Ben-Gurion archive.
Right.
And it was, the 3 pages were attached with a pin. Then I did a program with the BBC, the Suez Crisis BBC version.
Right.
They interviewed some of the survivors from
Well,
Sèvres.
so people can go look that up. But the thing about this top secret meeting is they were all really crap at being secret. I mean, one of the most, Avi has this shock of white hair. David Ben-Gurion stood out in a crowd, and he was spotted at the airport. What were the reasons? Because it's important to note that Anthony Eden did not seek parliamentary approval, party approval. He took no approval at all to be part of these talks. And David Ben-Gurion rocks up at the airport. I mean, what were the reasons given, and how badly did that secret, how terribly did they keep the secret?
Well, that secret, funnily enough, didn't come out. An airport worker spotted him and said, goodness, that looks a lot like David Ben-Gurion. What's he doing here in Paris? Told a journalist friend who said, well, that's just not possible. So didn't follow it up. But what happened was that, in fact, the French didn't care about keeping this secret. Anthony Eden cared about keeping this secret because...
From his own cabinet?
Yeah, from everybody,
Yeah.
but also particularly from the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And for the reason that he had said to Eisenhower straight away after the nationalization, we must invade Egypt and take the canal. Eisenhower had written back to him, and he'd said... I give you my personal, he wrote a letter saying, absolutely do not do it, saying, I give you my personal assurance, my personal conviction of the absolute unwisdom of even contemplating the use of military force at this moment. Many years later, when Eden wrote his memoir, he described this letter as, "The president did not rule out the use of force," which is an example of such selective reading that one actually wonders about the sanity. And so Eden was but he knew that if he did this, not only was it kind of going to blow Britain's relationship with the US, potentially, although I think he was still hoping they'd just go along with it once it started to happen, but also that, yes, within his own party, people didn't believe this was the right thing to do. So he cared, but the French didn't care at all about keeping it secret. In fact, I mean, as you could then see by what they went on to do in Algeria and so on, they were very unshy about being imperialist. Socialist government, actually, Guy Mollet, but, you know, they didn't care about being imperialists. So what happened is the French minister, a couple of days after the Protocol of Sèvres, went to a nightclub in Paris with a Lebanese businessman and started bragging that they had done this protocol. The Lebanese businessman went straight to a junior Conservative MP in Britain and told him. The junior Conservative MP took him to the chief whip of the Conservative Party, then Edward Heath, who said, no, we don't care. So he took him to Hugh Gaitskell, the head of the Labour Party. So within a week, the Labour Party knew in Britain this was happening. And this is what happens with conspiracies, is actually it's very hard to keep them secret because people gossip.
I mean, normally it's easier than this, but it's like nobody was really trying. And the thing is, it's predicated. I mean, first of all, it's done in 2 days, right? This life, this world reshaping is pretty much back of the fag packet kind of stuff in 2 days is done and put together. But it is contingent on people being in a certain place at a certain time, and it doesn't, surprise, surprise, go to plan. I mean, Ussama, just talk us through why the plans fell to pieces.
Well, for three principal reasons. I mean, one, of course, is that Egypt and Nasser refused to accept the implications that they didn't have control over their destiny and their freedom. That's I think the most important reason. The second reason, the proximate reason, is that the US and Eisenhower specifically were duped and misled and not informed, and they refused and rejected the idea that the Britain and France and Israel could simply turn back the clock to a colonial age, especially without US consent. And the third reason is that the Soviets also were opposed. So those three reasons, I think, were the principal reasons why they opposed. And Eisenhower famously in 1956, in October 1956, addressed the American people. It's quite interesting given what's happening today in the US. And Eisenhower said there can be no international law if we apply one set of laws to our friends and another to our opponents. There can only be law, and I'm paraphrasing here, if we apply the same law to everybody. And that's an important position, quite frankly.
Yeah, and the other reason is because the troops on the ground did not make the progress at the times that the fag packet suggested they would. And that's pivotal. Timing is everything in this, isn't it?
Yes, they tried to go ahead with this plan. And, you know, Israel invaded Egyptian territory in the Sinai, which is, you know, a desert and kind of quite spotty. And, you know, there was this sort of pantomime performance where the British and French had this conference in Paris and came out and said, okay, we've declared an ultimatum. And both sides have to withdraw 10 miles from the canal. And if they don't, within 12 hours, Britain and France are going to intervene as peacekeepers, because, of course, we must keep the world peace. Very important. This isn't a secret conspiracy at all. No, no, no.
Nothing
We're
to
being
see
very good
here.
people. Nothing
Yes,
to see.
right.
The problem was, at this point, the front of fighting between Israel and Egypt was nowhere near the canal. It was actually between 75 and 125 miles east of the canal. So what they were actually asking them to do is for Egypt, which was also the victim of aggression, to retreat about 85 to 135 miles into its own territory, while Israel was actually being told to advance a huge distance into Egypt. So immediately, even the people listening to this broadcast on the radio were like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
This makes no sense.
Yeah, you know, anybody would just, a child would say, hang on, I know numbers. I know 75 miles does not equate to what we're being told.
Withdrawing 10 miles from this.
You know, I'm really interested in one thing that this throws up, is that David Ben-Gurion seemed to trust the French at this time a lot more than he trusted the British. Why would that be?
Ben-Gurion didn't trust the British because he thought that when the moment of truth came in 1947-48, Britain betrayed the Zionists, which was not true. But he didn't trust the British, whereas he did trust the French. because in 1950 there was a tripartite declaration to regulate the flow of arms to the Middle East to achieve stability. And France and America and Britain signed the tripartite declaration. But in 1954, the French started supplying arms to Israel secretly. So that's why he believed the French, and also because all the secret talks preceding Sèvres were bilateral. They were between the Israelis and the French. Eden was a latecomer. Eden was offered a military option when there was diplomatic efforts at the UN which really resolved the conflict. And Eden at the last minute switched from the diplomatic track to the military track for the reasons that Alex just explained. He had an obsession with Nasser, and the main war aim of all three belligerents was to topple Nasser. Then they had their own agenda.
But it doesn't topple Nasser. What it does is it acts as a lightning rod in the Arab world where Nasser becomes an icon and a hero. Just tell us more about how the rest of the Arab world reacted.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, Nasser had already, come to the global stage in Bandung in 1955. So he already was with Nehru and with all these other great third world leaders. He was already there on the world stage. But Suez, of course, and the failure of the colonial operation, the British, French, Israeli invasion of Egypt, that failure, and more importantly, Nasser's defiance and Egypt's defiance, which I think we always underestimate in these narrative accounts that focus only on the British or the French. These accounts, this defiance, this anti-colonial defiance, I think, paved the way for a sense that, again, because Nasser was represented far more than just Egypt or the Arab world. He represented, like Nehru, like other anti-colonial leaders of the 1950s, he represented the world in its broadest possible sense. And I think the fact that Nasser survived was, I think, a signal sort of turning point in the history of the Middle East. It certainly ended British colonial influence in a major way in the Middle East, and sort of inaugurated, ironically and perversely, eventually, sort of US hegemony.
So we're going to take questions in a moment, and can I just make a request that you just put your hand up really high, and when I call on you, just stand up and someone get a microphone. I'm going to do it to two sides, so mic holders just get there quickly. If one of you can come on this side, one of you on this side. But Alex, before we take questions, just briefly, I mean, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening where, events in Hungary are also taking place at great speed, and it will prove to be a mandate to the Soviets to act in a certain way. Just speak to that for a moment.
Yes, for reasons that are actually entirely coincidental, but that nobody at the time really believed were coincidental. This was also literally the same days of the first big anti-Soviet rebellion in the satellite states, the USSR, which was in Hungary. There was a very big rebellion against a very hard form of Stalinist Soviet control that they had implemented. And so it was a very difficult geopolitical position, and that's why people started talking about this as potentially World War III. That was a term they used a lot at the time, because there was a sense it was kicking off everywhere, and the Soviets assumed that what was happening in Hungary was a rebellion caused by the CIA. They thought that the CIA were promoting this, and therefore that what Britain was doing in Egypt must be in cahoots with the Americans somehow, because this was a coordinated thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't. It was a spontaneous revolution. And meanwhile, the Americans were very worried that the Soviets were also going to be getting in with Egypt. And so everybody was extremely tense about all of these things and positioning wildly. And the Soviets really sort of smashed that rebellion in Hungary. I mean, sort of literally drove tanks over it. Very, very brutal repression. And when they sort of felt reasonably confident that that had happened, which is around the 4th of November, in 1956, they issued a threat to London and Paris, which was sort of quite carefully worded, but effectively said, what would you do if we aimed rockets at London and Paris? How would you feel if we did that? And effectively, this was taken as a threat of a nuclear attack on London and Paris. And there's a lot of discussion about exactly what made Eden back down. It might be something we get into in questions. And partly it was the Americans putting sanctions on Britain. Some people have said the only effective use of sanctions in history was possibly the Americans cutting off Britain's oil over Suez. It's possible, like Eden really didn't have a lot of support at home, his position was collapsing, but also the fact the Soviet Union were threatening to nuke London was probably not irrelevant.
No, probably not. Put your hand up if you have a question. Okay, I see a woman over there who has a question. Get a mic to her. And on this side, put your hand up proud. If you do this, I can't see you. Okay, this side has it. Put your hand back up and tell me if you've got a microphone. I mean, just while you get the microphone, this effectively ends Anthony Eden's career and ruins his reputation. So he is still remembered for the scandal that was caused and the fact that the Queen was utterly, first of all, devastated that this was done in her government's name and appalled that he hadn't sought any kind of democratic mandate to do this. Question, you've got a mic now?
Yes.
Great, go for it.
So as historians, you've read a lot about the Suez Canal and the Suez War. How do you think that these 5 countries could have handled this problem more efficiently if there was a better solution, considering everything that you've read about the war and from all the different perspectives that you've had about this war?
Okay, that's a big question. Do you want to take it first of all?
I mean, the 5 countries, I mean, in other words, how did... I mean, it's very simple. The question really ultimately comes down to, do people have a right to self-determination, whether it's Egyptians, whether it's Palestinians, whether it's Indians, whether it's any people around the world, and are they willing to defy the colonial powers when the colonial powers resort to the same old, ultimately coercive power? That's what it comes down to. And do colonial powers understand that an era has changed? The interesting thing is where we are today. It just seems like a completely different era.
Yeah, I mean, Avi, do you concur that actually it depends on your perspective of what the goal should have been, but if they had behaved slightly differently, would we be seeing a different Middle East, particularly I'm thinking about Palestine right now, would it be very different today?
The history of the Middle East is the history of colonial powers trying to impose their will and domination over the Arabs and serving their own self-interest. Selfishness is the DNA of colonial powers. And as Ussama explains so eloquently, the history of the Arab world is a struggle for freedom and independence and dignity. And Nasser represented all that. So Suez was just one episode in this long-term struggle between the colonial powers and the Arabs. And the creation of Israel is seen by the Arabs as an imperialist imposition of a foreign body in the heartland of the Middle East in order to keep the Arabs weak and divided. And this pattern continues with American imperialism today, with Trump trying, just as the British and the French imposed a new order on the Middle East after the First World War, after the war in Gaza, Trump is imposing a new colonial power on the Middle East.
So are you saying that nowhere in their mind was the thought that actually, you know what, we've had the Holocaust, we have a history of making Jews feel unsafe in the world, we kind of owe them? We owe them something, and this is, this wasn't in their calculus at all?
The Western sense of guilt over the Holocaust led to a feeling that something titanic had to be done for the Jews to compensate them. And this found expression in the UN Partition Resolution of 1947, to turn Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. And in a rare moment in the history of the UN, both America and the Soviet Union voted for partition for a Jewish state. So it was a sense of guilt by the Western powers towards the Jews. But the price was paid not by the Western powers, not by the perpetrators of the Holocaust. The price was paid by the Palestinians.
Another question. Right, there's a gentleman there who has his hand. I've seen it wave. You are a very shy side. What is wrong with you? Oh, there we. Thank you. And there's a mic. Is there a second microphone for the woman there? Okay. All right. Can you put your hand up again? Very striking lady. There we go. Okay. Let's take a question from here. Okay.
This question is for Alex. Did Anthony Eden need a welfare check, given how erratically he was behaving?
So there's a lot of discussion about this. Eden was very unwell at this time. And he'd actually had a physical collapse about a month before. He'd been visiting his wife, who'd been in hospital to have a dental operation. And he'd physically collapsed and had to be hospitalized himself. We also know that he was, like many leaders at the time, JFK, taking quite a lot of amphetamines to keep him, alert and alive. Now, these days, we wouldn't really think that's a very good idea to be in charge of, a nuclear arsenal and so on when you're hopped up on a bunch of bennies, as he was. Basically, when this all collapsed afterwards, a lot of the other British politicians really went big on this. The cabinet ministers saying, well, he was terribly ill and he was on all these drugs, and this is what happened. But at the time, they all agreed with him, so what was their excuse, is going to be my question about that. So I think we have to acknowledge that Eden was very unwell. I think his judgment was in a real problem, but then how did he carry Macmillan with him? How did he carry, well, Macmillan burnt his diaries, so we don't know.
Okay, the question over there.
Hello. My father actually served at Suez. He was in the British Navy, but he was always very embarrassed about it. He never spoke about it. He's passed away now, but with light of all the things that you've come, how would he feel now?
How would he feel now? Who wants to take that?
Well, I wouldn't presume to tell your father how to feel.
But as far as sort of, history is concerned, they do not judge Eden kindly. I mean, I can tell you that much. But I don't know your dad, so don't know. Who has a question on this side? Please, hands up. There are a couple. Who else has got a question? There's a gentleman right at the back. You're going to have to run for your job there. It's on. Thank you. And anyone else on the shy side? Oh, there's a hand up there. Can you have to look? Wave, 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 wave. Right, okay. Let's go right to the back, over here.
So, listening to you, I understand that peoples have the right to self-determination. My question is, does my people have the right to self-determination? I'm part of the Jewish people. I also happen to live in Israel. I know this word is going to cause a strange reaction amongst most of the people here. I'm also a Zionist. So do we have the right to self-determination, or is it just everyone else?
Avi.
The Jewish people have the right to self-determination, and in 1947, the UN voted for the partition of Palestine. This resolution was a charter of legitimacy for a Jewish state. So the Jewish people realized their right to self-determination in 1948 with the proclamation of the State of Israel, but they've denied the Palestinians the right to self-determination ever since. And today, they don't just reject utterly the notion of any Palestinian state, but they are perpetrating genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. That's the problem.
May I say something? Excuse me.
Okay, so the clock, sir, wait.
Let me just say one thing, if I may, in answer to that sort of provocation. First of all, I would say to the gentleman, I think you should read some history, and read some history about Palestine and Israel, the actual history. Second of all, self-determination is usually a concept that's applied to people on their own land. And the reality is that the 1947 partition plan that Avi referred to, of course, gave the Jewish population of Palestine the majority of the land of Palestine, even though they were the minority of the population. The third and last thing to say is that Zionism, since you declared yourself to be a Zionist, and everyone has a right to be whatever they want, I suppose, but Zionism, of course, emerges in Europe, responding to European anti-Semitism and proposing European solutions, i.e. settler colonialism in Palestine. The issue really ultimately is whether you're a Zionist or a non-Zionist or whatever you want to be or anyone wants to be, are you for equality and dignity of every single person? That is the real question.
Okay. Now, I know the gentleman wants to come back, but this thing has gone to zero for quite some minutes now. So, I know that I've got sort of signals of why can we get the question that I promised? So, the waving man. Where are you, waving man? Do you have the microphone? You do. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hi. One hears a lot about how Anthony Eden came to a bad end, but what happened to the French, who also were equal losers?
Alex?
The French were, as I said, they had absolutely no shame about this whatsoever. The French weren't bothered that they'd done this. They had also, by the way, taken the opportunity to kidnap the leaders of the Algerian independence movement during this all going down. They'd actually brought their plane down and kidnapped them and took them to Paris and imprisoned them for many years. And then, as we see, of course, they went on to have a war in Algeria, really, and continue imposing this. So the French had a completely different attitude, where the British at this point, I think because India had gone and the empire was supposedly in this Commonwealth phase that was supposed to look much more consensual, you can all, of course, make your own decisions about whether it was, had a sort of sense that this at least ought to be hidden and that there should be some shame about this. The French had no sense of that whatsoever. So they carried on.
So I've got a bank of pleading eyes now saying, please wind up. I'm going to. But I do want to take some time just to thank our panelists today. Please join in thanking Alex von Tunzelmann, Avi Shlaim, and Ussama Makdisi.